Everyone who worked in the Calvetti building understood that there were invisible lines you didn't cross, unspoken rules that governed survival in a world where power was measured in blood and loyalty. And I had learned those rules faster than anyone expected when I first walked through those gleaming steel doors 6 months ago, with nothing but a forged resume, and the kind of desperation that makes you brave or stupid, sometimes both. The first rule was simple enough. Never look Dante Calvetti directly in the eyes unless he demanded it, because those storm gray eyes could strip away every carefully constructed lie you'd ever told yourself. And the second rule was perhaps even more crucial. Never, under any circumstances, ask questions about the men who came and went through his private elevator with blood on their knuckles and death in their expressions. But there was a third rule, one that had developed specifically around me over the past 6 months, whispered about in break rooms, and discussed in hushed tones by the other administrative staff, who watched me with a mixture of envy and confusion. Ophelia Thorne leaves every single day at exactly 3:17 p.m., and absolutely no one, not the underbosses, not the capos, not even Dante Calvetti himself, was allowed to question why. I had perfected the routine with the kind of precision that would have made a Swiss watchmaker weep with appreciation, because in a world controlled by a man who noticed everything, who could tell when someone was lying by the microscopic dilation of their pupils, and who had built an empire on reading the subtle shifts in human behavior, I had somehow managed to maintain this one small rebellion, this single pocket of mystery that he couldn't penetrate. Every morning I arrived at precisely 6:47 a.m., always 13 minutes before anyone else, always carrying the same black leather portfolio that had cost me 2 weeks' worth of grocery money but projected exactly the kind of competent professionalism that made people trust you with their secrets. And I would spend those 13 minutes preparing his office exactly the way he liked it. Coffee at 168 degrees Fahrenheit, morning reports arranged by priority rather than chronology, his fountain pen, the ridiculously expensive Mont Blanc that probably cost more than most people's cars, positioned at a 45-degree angle to his leather desk pad. The work itself was surprisingly straightforward for someone employed by the city's most feared crime family, because Dante Calvetti ran his organization like a Fortune 500 company, complete with quarterly projections and efficiency metrics. And my job was to be the impenetrable wall between him and the chaos of the outside world, to filter every request, manage every appointment, and ensure that his time was spent only on matters worthy of his attention. I scheduled meetings between legitimate businessmen who had no idea they were laundering money through carefully structured real estate deals, coordinated conferences with city officials who convinced themselves that their generous campaign donations had nothing to do with overlooked building violations, and maintained calendars that would have made a presidential chief of staff exhausted just reading them. And I did it all with the kind of cool efficiency that had earned me a salary 3 times what I could have made in any legitimate corporation. But it was the leaving that had become my signature, my one act of defiance in a world where defiance usually ended with a body in the river. And I had started the practice on my very first day, without really understanding that I was establishing a pattern that would eventually consume Dante Calvetti's every waking thought. At 3:16 p.m., I would save whatever document I was working on with deliberate keystrokes, close my laptop with a soft click that somehow seemed louder than it should in the hushed atmosphere of the executive floor, and reach for my purse, a simple black leather bag that contained exactly 3 items: my wallet, my keys, and a small photo of 6 smiling faces that I kept hidden in the inner pocket, where no one would accidentally see it, and start asking questions I couldn't answer. The walk from my desk to the private elevator was exactly 43 steps, and I had counted them so many times that I could navigate the distance with my eyes closed, passing the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city like a kingdom spread out for Dante's amusement, walking across marble floors that reflected the recessed lighting in pools of warm amber, moving through a space designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. I never rushed, because rushing implied guilt or fear, and I had learned long ago that the best way to hide something was to do it with absolute confidence, to act as though you had every right to your secrets, and that anyone who questioned them was being unreasonable, so I maintained a steady, unhurried pace that suggested I had somewhere to be, but wasn't concerned about getting there. The elevator doors would open at exactly 3:17 p.m., timed with the kind of precision that had to be intentional, and I would step inside without looking back, without glancing toward Dante's office where I could feel his eyes on me like a physical weight. And for those 47 seconds of descent from the 20th floor to the lobby, I would allow myself to breathe, really breathe, for the first time since arriving that morning. The lobby was always busy at that hour, filled with legitimate employees from the various companies that Dante owned or controlled, people who had no idea that their paychecks were signed by a man who had ordered his first execution at the age of 19. And I would blend into that crowd, just another professional woman in sensible heels and a tailored suit, making my way toward the revolving doors and the freedom of the street beyond. I knew he watched me leave, every single day, had known it from the very beginning when I first noticed the slight shift in his blinds at 3:16 p.m., the way his office door would crack open just enough for him to have a clear view of my desk. And over the months, I had felt his attention intensify from casual observation to something that felt almost obsessive, as though my daily departure had become a puzzle he couldn't solve, and the not knowing was eating away at his legendary control. His men had started to notice too, the way he would check his watch at 3:15 p.m., regardless of what meeting he was in, the way he would pause mid-sentence at 3:16 p.m., as though listening for the specific sound of my laptop closing. And I had heard the rumors that circulated through the organization like wildfire, that I was meeting a lover, that I was working for the FBI, that I was running some kind of side business that competed with Calvetti interests. The truth was so much simpler and so much more complicated than any of their theories, and it was a truth I guarded with the same ferocity that Dante Calvetti guarded his empire, because the 6 faces in that hidden photograph depended on my ability to maintain this double life, to be the perfectly efficient secretary by day, and something entirely different in those hours after 3:17 p.m. I had built my entire existence around protecting them, around ensuring that no one in Dante's world ever discovered that his impeccable secretary disappeared every afternoon into a crumbling basement in the kind of neighborhood where even his enforcers traveled in pairs, where I transformed from Ophelia Thorne, professional assistant in designer suits, into something softer and more vulnerable, into the only mother figure 6 abandoned children had ever known. Today felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I went through my usual routine. And when I glanced toward Dante's office at 3:15 p.m., I found him standing, at his window with his back to me, his broad shoulders tense beneath the custom Italian suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. And there was something in his posture that suggested a decision had been made. A line was about to be crossed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that 6 months of successful deception had made me see threats where none existed. But my instincts had kept me alive through foster homes and street corners and situations that should have destroyed me, and those same instincts were screaming that today was the day everything changed. At 3:16 p.m., I closed my laptop with hands that wanted to tremble but didn't, because I had learned to control my body's betrayals long before I learned to control anything else. And I reached for my purse with the same steady grace I always did, pulling the strap over my shoulder and standing from my chair in one fluid motion that I had practiced until it looked effortless. The walk to the elevator felt longer than usual, as though the 43 steps had somehow multiplied, and I could feel Dante's attention on me like a spotlight, hot and invasive and impossible to ignore. But I didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the weight of his gaze, because looking back would be an admission that I knew he was watching, that I cared what he thought about my daily departure. The elevator doors opened exactly on schedule, and I stepped inside with a relief that I was careful not to show on my face. But as the doors began to close, I made the mistake of glancing up one final time. And there he was, Dante Calvetti, standing in the doorway of his office with his hands in his pockets, and an expression on his devastatingly handsome face that I had never seen before. Something that looked almost like hunger or desperation, or maybe both. Our eyes met for exactly 2 seconds, storm gray locked with ice blue, and in that moment I understood with perfect clarity that my carefully constructed routine, my one safe, rebellion, was about to be demolished by a man who had never learned to leave well enough alone, who had built his entire life on knowing things that other people wanted to keep hidden. As the elevator descended and my stomach dropped with it, I pressed my hand against the cool metal wall and tried to convince myself that I was wrong, that Dante Calvetti had more important things to worry about than where his secretary went every afternoon at 3:17 p.m. But I knew better, had always known better, because men like him didn't let mysteries exist in their world, and I had been foolish to think I could maintain mine forever. When I stepped out into the lobby and made my way through the revolving doors into the cool autumn air, I didn't notice the black Mercedes that pulled away from the curb 3 seconds after I turned the corner, didn't see the way it followed me at a careful distance as I made my way toward the subway station, didn't realize that in exactly 47 minutes, Dante Calvetti would discover the truth I had been hiding since the day I walked into his office with my forged resume and my desperate lies, and that discovery would change both of our lives in ways neither of us could possibly imagine. The subway ride to the East End took exactly 23 minutes during off-peak hours, and I had timed this journey so many times that I could predict the exact moment when the relatively clean cars filled with professionals and students would give way to the graffiti-scarred trains that served neighborhoods the city had forgotten, where the seats were torn and the floors were sticky with substances I didn't want to identify, and the other passengers were the kind of people who had learned to make themselves invisible because visibility in these parts meant vulnerability. I sat with my purse clutched in my lap and my eyes forward, adopting the same blank expression that everyone else wore like armor, because the cardinal rule of survival in places like this was to never look like you had anything worth taking, and to never, under any circumstances, make eye contact with anyone who might interpret your gaze as a challenge or an invitation. The transition from Dante's world to this one was always jarring, like stepping from a 5-star restaurant directly into a landfill. And sometimes I wondered what he would think if he could see the route I traveled every single day, if he could witness the way his perfectly coiffed secretary navigated streets where broken glass glittered in the gutters like deadly diamonds, and where the smell of garbage and desperation hung in the air like a toxic fog. This was Volkov territory, controlled by the Russian Bratva, who had been fighting with the Calvetti family over shipping rights and protection rackets for the better part of a decade. And I had to be insane to come here every day, to walk these streets as though I had every right to be here, as though the designer suit I wore and the leather bag I carried didn't mark me as an outsider who should be either robbed or worse. But I had grown up in neighborhoods like this, had learned to navigate their particular dangers before I learned to read, and there was a language spoken in places the civilized world abandoned that I understood in my bones, the language of desperation and survival, of people who had fallen through every crack in the social safety net and landed in a place where the only rules were the ones you made for yourself. I walked with purpose but not haste, my heels clicking against cracked pavement in a rhythm that suggested I knew exactly where I was going and that I belonged here and the few people I passed. A junkie nodding off against a dumpster, a group of teenagers who watched me with calculating eyes, an old woman pushing a shopping cart filled with her entire life, recognized something in my bearing that made them look away, that identified me as someone who had survived worse than whatever they might do to me. The apartment building came into view after a 10-minute walk that took me deeper into territory that should have terrified me. A 6-story structure that had probably been impressive in the 1940s, but now looked like it was held together by hope and stolen electricity, with broken windows covered in cardboard and fire escapes that sagged under the weight of forgotten bicycles and dying plants. The front door hung perpetually open, the lock having been broken so many times that the building's absentee landlord had finally given up on replacing it, and I slipped inside without breaking stride, immediately enveloped by the smell of mildew and cooking odors and human misery that had soaked into the walls over decades of neglect. I didn't go up, which is what anyone following me would expect, because people who entered buildings like this were usually residents heading to their apartments or dealers visiting their clients. But instead I turned toward the back of the lobby where a Dr. marked "Maintenance, Keep Out" stood slightly ajar, and I pulled it open with the familiarity of someone who had done this exact thing hundreds of times before, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness so complete it seemed to have physical weight. The basement was technically condemned, had been for years according to the yellowing notice that someone had taped to the door and that had long since been ignored. But condemned spaces had an advantage that legal ones didn't. No one looked for you there. No one asked questions about what you were doing, and no one cared what happened in the darkness as long as it stayed hidden. I pulled out my phone and activated the flashlight, because the building's basement lighting had stopped working sometime during the previous century, and began my descent downstairs that creaked ominously under my weight, each step requiring careful placement, because some of the treads were rotted through and would collapse if you hit them wrong, and I had memorized which ones were safe through trial and error that had left me with bruises I'd had to explain away to curious coworkers. The descent took almost 2 minutes, far longer than it should have taken to go down a single flight of stairs, but I moved carefully because falling here would mean no one would find me until it was far too late, and the children were depending on me to arrive safe and whole and ready to pretend for a few hours that the world wasn't as cruel as we all knew it was. The basement itself was larger than anyone would expect, stretching beneath the entire footprint of the building in a maze of rooms that had once served purposes I could only guess at. Storage, maybe, or maintenance areas, or perhaps something more sinister given the neighborhood's history. But Ruth had transformed the central room into something that almost resembled a home before she died, stringing up battery-powered lanterns that cast warm pools of light against the concrete, walls and covering the floor with carpet remnants she'd collected from dumpsters behind furniture stores, and arranging mismatched furniture that people had abandoned on street corners into a space that could almost be cozy if you didn't look too closely at the water stains on the ceiling or the mold growing in the corners. The sound of children's voices reached me before I rounded the final corner, a sound that never failed to make something in my chest simultaneously tighten and release, because these voices meant they were still here, still safe, still surviving, despite a system that had failed them so completely that they had fallen into the gaps between official neglect and unofficial abandonment. I stepped into the light of the main room and was immediately mobbed by small bodies, arms wrapping around my waist and my legs, voices calling my name in a chorus that made me forget, for just a moment, about the danger I courted every time I walked through Dante Calvetti's door with my secrets and my lies. "Ophelia, you're here! Marcus said you might not come today because it's cold outside, but I told him you always come. You promised you would always come." That was Mira, 7 years old with tangled brown hair and eyes too old for her face, the newest addition to our makeshift family, found 3 weeks ago sleeping in a cardboard box behind a Chinese restaurant with nothing but a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days, and a fierce determination not to cry no matter how scared she was. I knelt down so I was at her level, ignoring the way my expensive skirt was definitely getting ruined against the basement floor, and pulled her into a hug that she returned with the kind of desperate strength that broke my heart every single time, because children shouldn't have to hug like they were afraid you might disappear if they didn't hold tight enough. "I will always come, baby. I promise you that. Nothing could keep me away from you guys, absolutely nothing in this entire world." The others gathered around with varying degrees of enthusiasm, because some of them had been here longer and had learned that promises were things adults made before they inevitably broke them. But even the most skeptical couldn't quite hide their relief at my arrival. Marcus, at 14, trying so hard to be the man of this strange family, with his carefully maintained toughness that cracked around the edges when he thought no one was looking. Isabella and Sophia, 10-year-old twins who had been found locked in a closet by their mother's boyfriend and who still sometimes woke up screaming. Dante, And yes, the irony of his name was not lost on me. At 12, quiet and watchful and far too good at making himself invisible. And little Tommy at 5, who barely spoke at all, but whose smile when I arrived could light up even this dark basement. I had brought dinner in the insulated bag I carried inside my purse, sandwiches from the deli near Calvetti Tower that I purchased, every day with cash so there would be no credit card trail, along with fruit and cookies and juice boxes, and I distributed the food with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this for far longer than 6 months, who had in fact been doing some version of this since I was 15 years old, and Ruth had found me trying to steal bread from her shopping cart, and instead of calling the police had taken me home and taught me that survival didn't have to mean being alone. We ate together in a circle on the floor, because the furniture Ruth had collected wasn't sufficient for all of us to sit comfortably, and I listened to their stories about their days with the kind of attention that children who had been ignored by every adult in their lives deserved. Marcus talking about the part-time job he'd found washing dishes at a restaurant that didn't ask for ID. Isabella describing a stray cat she'd been feeding in the alley. Sophia worrying about an upcoming math test at the public school she and her sister still attended through a combination of forged documents and sheer determination. These moments were what I lived for. These brief hours when I could pretend that I was giving them something resembling a normal childhood. When I could forget that we were squatting in a condemned basement and that I was funding our existence through a salary I earned by working for a man who could destroy all of us with a single phone call if he ever discovered what I was doing. After dinner, I pulled out the book I'd been reading to them, a battered copy of the Chronicles of Narnia that had been Ruth's, and before that had belonged to someone else, whose name was written in fading ink on the inside cover, and the children arranged themselves around me with the kind of choreographed precision that came from nightly repetition. Mira in my lap, Tommy pressed against my right side, the twins flanking me on the left, Marcus and young Dante sitting just far enough away to maintain their teenage dignity, but close enough to hear every word. I had just opened to the marked page, had just begun reading about Lucy and Mr. Tumnus, and a world where magic was real, and wardrobes could transport you somewhere better than where you were, when I felt it. That same electric awareness that had plagued me all afternoon in the office. That sense of being watched that had kept me alive through situations that should have killed me. The children were absorbed in the story. Didn't notice the way my voice had gone slightly strained, or how my eyes kept flickering toward the darkened doorway that led to the rest of the basement. And I forced myself to continue reading, even as every survival instinct I possessed screamed that something was wrong, that someone had followed me here, that the secret I had protected so carefully was about to be exposed in the worst possible way. I saw the shadow before I saw the man, a darkness that seemed to detach itself from the general gloom of the basement and take human form. And when Dante Calvetti stepped into the light of our lanterns, with an expression on his face that I had never seen before, something raw and shocked and almost vulnerable, I felt my entire carefully constructed world begin to crumble around me, because there was no explanation I could give, no lie I could tell, no way to make this anything other than what it obviously was. His secretary, the woman he trusted with his most sensitive business, had been hiding 6 children in a basement in enemy territory and using every moment away from his office to play house in the ruins of a condemned building. The children sensed the change in atmosphere before I could even process what was happening. Their survival instincts, honed by lives spent navigating adult unpredictability and danger. And Marcus was on his feet immediately, with a piece of rusted pipe he'd hidden behind the donated couch, his 14-year-old body positioning itself between Dante, Calvetti, and the younger children with a protectiveness that would have been admirable if it wasn't so utterly futile against a man who had killed his first rival before Marcus was even born. I stood slowly, keeping my movements careful and non-threatening, acutely aware that one wrong word or gesture could turn this situation from merely catastrophic into something far worse. And I held up a hand to Marcus in a gesture that said, "Stand down," while my eyes never left Dante's face, searching for some clue as to what he was thinking. what he planned to do with the information that was now burning itself into his consciousness. "It's okay, Marcus. He's not going to hurt us," I said, with a confidence I absolutely did not feel, because the truth was that I had no idea what Dante Calvetti was capable of in this moment, had never seen him outside the context of his pristine office and his carefully controlled empire, and the man standing before me in the flickering lantern light of a condemned basement looked like someone who had been fundamentally shaken in a way that his life of violence and power had never quite managed to accomplish. "This is my boss, Mr. Calvetti, and he's just leaving because he followed me here without permission, and is about to realize that was a terrible invasion of privacy that we're going to discuss tomorrow in a professional setting." Marcus didn't lower the pipe, his street-smart instincts apparently more reliable than my optimistic deflection, and Dante's eyes flickered to the makeshift weapon with something that might have been amusement or respect, before returning to my face with an intensity that made me feel like he was cataloging every micro-expression, every tiny tell that might reveal the truth behind this impossible scene. "Everyone out," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that people obeyed without thinking, the tone of a man who had spent his entire adult life issuing commands that were never questioned. But these children had survived by not trusting anyone with authority, and they looked to me instead of him, waiting for my direction in a way that must have been both novel and irritating for someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Nobody is going anywhere," I said firmly, placing myself physically between Dante and the children in a mirror of Marcus's protective stance. And I saw something flicker across Dante's face that might have been surprise or anger or something else entirely, because I had spent 6 months being the perfect employee, agreeing with his decisions and facilitating his wishes, and this open defiance was probably more shocking than finding me in a basement with 6 orphans. "These children live here. This is their home, and you're the intruder. So if anyone is leaving, it's you. And we can have whatever conversation you think we need to have tomorrow, during normal business hours when you're not trespassing in a place you have absolutely no right to be." The silence that followed my declaration stretched out like pulled taffy, thick and uncomfortable and threatening to snap at any moment, and I could see Dante processing this new version of me, the woman who spoke to him with the same ice-cold authority he usually wielded. And I knew that I was playing a dangerous game because men like Dante Calvetti didn't respond well to challenges, especially not from people they employed, and therefore believed they owned in some fundamental way. But I also knew that backing down now would signal weakness, would suggest that he had power here that I wasn't willing to concede. And so I held my ground and met his storm-gray eyes with my ice-blue ones and waited to see which one of us would break first. "We'll talk now," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of steel that suggested this wasn't a request, despite being phrased like one. And then he did something I absolutely didn't expect. He looked at the children, really looked at them, his gaze moving from Marcus with his pipe to the twins clutching each other to Mira, who had wrapped herself around my leg like a particularly determined barnacle, and something in his expression shifted in a way I couldn't quite read. "Unless you'd prefer to have this conversation in front of them, in which case they're going to hear some things about the man who signs your paychecks that might give them nightmares worse than whatever they've already survived." The implicit threat in his words was clear, and I felt anger surge through me like a physical force, hot and dangerous, and completely at odds with the careful control I'd maintained for 6 months in his presence, because he was using the children as leverage, weaponizing my love for them against my need to protect them from the darker realities of the world I'd entered when I walked into his office with my forged credentials and desperate lies. "Fine," I bit out, hating that he'd backed me into a corner but recognizing that I had no good options here, no way to navigate this situation that didn't involve some kind of compromise. "Marcus, you're in charge until I get back. Keep the door locked. Don't open it for anyone but me. And if I'm not back in an hour, you take everyone and go to the backup location we talked about." Marcus nodded, his face grim with understanding, and I saw Dante's eyebrow raise slightly at the mention of a backup location, at the implication that I had contingency plans for emergencies, that this makeshift family had protocols and procedures that suggested a level of organization he probably hadn't expected from a basement full of street kids. I extracted myself from Mira's grip with promises that I would return soon, ignored the fear in her eyes that said she'd heard adults make that promise before, and had learned it was usually a lie, and followed Dante back through the maze of basement rooms toward the stairs that would take us up and away from the one place in the world where I felt like I was doing something that mattered. The walk back up to street level was silent except for the sound of our footsteps on rotting wood, and I was hyper-aware of Dante behind me. Could feel his presence like a physical weight, and I knew he was probably cataloging every detail of this place, memorizing the route, adding it to the vast database of information he maintained about everything and everyone in his orbit. We emerged into the dying light of late afternoon, the sun already beginning its descent behind the skeletal buildings that surrounded us, and the cold November air felt like a slap after the relatively warm basement, raising goosebumps on my arms that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the conversation I was about to have. Dante's Mercedes was parked half a block away, looking as out of place in this neighborhood as a diamond in a landfill, and I was momentarily stunned that it was still there, that it hadn't been stripped for parts or stolen entirely, before remembering that this was Volkov territory, and even the most desperate car thief would think twice before touching anything that might belong to someone connected to the Bratva. He opened the back door in a gesture that was probably meant to be courteous, but felt more like a command, and I slid into the leather interior with its new car smell and climate control, and reminded myself that I had survived worse than a difficult conversation with my employer. He got in beside me rather than taking the front seat, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. And the driver pulled away from the curb without being told, apparently well-trained in reading his boss's moods and knowing when to provide privacy. "Explain," Dante said, the single word carrying the weight of all his confusion and anger, and what might have been betrayal, as though I had somehow wronged him by having a life outside of his office, by harboring secrets he hadn't authorized. "I don't owe you an explanation about what I do with my personal time," I said, maintaining the defiance that had served me well in the basement, even though every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to apologize, to grovel, to do whatever it took to keep this job that funded the children's existence. But I had learned long ago that men like Dante respected strength more than submission, at least in the initial confrontation. You do when your personal time involves squatting in a condemned building in Volkov territory, with 6 unregistered children, while working for the head of the organization that's been at war with the Russians for the past decade, he countered, his voice still quiet, but carrying an edge that suggested his patience was wearing thin, that my continued defiance was testing limits I probably shouldn't test. You do when leaving at the same time every single day creates patterns that my enemies can exploit, when your mysterious disappearances make my men nervous and cause rumors that undermine my authority, when you're potentially creating a liability that could be used against me in ways you can't even begin to imagine. The fact that he'd immediately jumped to the strategic implications rather than the moral or legal ones told me everything I needed to know about how Dante Calvetti's mind worked, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach because he was right. I had been thinking about the children's safety and my own need to help them, but I hadn't fully considered how my actions might appear to someone who viewed the world through the lens of threats and vulnerabilities and potential weaknesses to exploit. "Those children have nothing to do with you or your business," I said, trying to keep my voice level, even as panic started to claw at the edges of my control. "They're just kids who fell through the cracks, who have nowhere else to go, and I'm giving them a safe place until I can figure out something more permanent." "In a condemned basement," Dante said, and there was something in his tone that might have been disbelief or judgment, or possibly both. "In Russian territory where you walk every single day like you have a death wish, where any one of Volkov's men could grab you off the street and use you to extract information or concessions from me. where you're apparently feeding and clothing 6 children on a secretary's salary which, while generous, can't possibly stretch far enough to cover everything they need. The implication that he'd done the math, that he'd calculated my expenses, and determined they didn't add up, made me realize that Dante had been paying far more attention to my life than I'd ever suspected, and I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with him discovering the basement and everything to do with the fact that he'd apparently been studying me, analyzing my patterns, trying to solve the mystery of who I was beneath the professional facade I presented every day. "I manage," I said stiffly, not willing to admit that he was right, that I'd been living on ramen noodles and skipping meals to make sure the children had enough, that my carefully maintained professional appearance was held together with discount store makeup and precisely targeted investments in the pieces that people actually noticed. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked, and the question surprised me because I'd expected more accusations or perhaps threats, not genuine curiosity about the timeline of my deception. "The children specifically? Since Ruth died 18 months ago and left me the responsibility of keeping them safe," I answered, deciding that there was no point in lying now that he'd discovered everything, that whatever was going to happen would happen regardless of how much information I withheld. "But I've been helping kids like this since I was 15 and Ruth found me trying to steal from her and decided to save me instead of calling the police like any reasonable person would have done." I watched his face as I spoke, saw him process this new information, saw the moment when he made the connection between the scared teenager I'd been and the composed woman sitting beside him in the back of his Mercedes, and something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like understanding, or possibly recognition, as though he saw something of himself in my story of survival and desperation. "Ruth was the woman who ran the underground orphanage," he said. And it wasn't a question because Dante Calvetti didn't ask questions when he already knew the answers. He just stated facts and waited to see if you'd contradict him. "She saved 17 children over 30 years, gave them food and shelter and love when the system had discarded them, and she did it all on a cashier's salary and pure stubborn determination," I said, feeling my throat tighten with emotion, refused to let show, because crying in front of Dante Calvetti felt like a weakness I couldn't afford. "When she died, someone had to take over. Someone had to make sure those kids didn't end up back on the streets or in situations worse than what they'd escaped, and I was the only one who knew about the basement, who had the skills to maintain the fiction, who understood what it meant to be thrown away by everyone who was supposed to care." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension, softer somehow, and when Dante finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. "You're embezzling from a mafia boss to run an orphanage in a condemned basement," he said, and there was a note of what might have been admiration or disbelief in his tone. "I'm using my own salary that I earn through legitimate work," I corrected sharply, because I wasn't going to let him characterize what I did as theft when I had never touched a single dollar that wasn't mine. "I've never taken anything from you except the paycheck I've more than earned with 80-hour work weeks and dealing with your impossible demands and maintaining a level of discretion that would make a CIA operative jealous. I might be a lot of things, Mr. Calvetti, but I do have some integrity." He laughed then, actually laughed, and the sound was so unexpected in the tension of the moment that I turned to stare at him, trying to understand what he found funny about this entire disaster. And what I saw in his face made my breath catch because he was looking at me like he'd never really seen me before, like I'd just revealed myself to be something entirely different than what he'd assumed. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish," he said, his storm gray eyes holding mine with an intensity that made me want to look away, but somehow couldn't. "And I haven't decided which yet, but either way, Miss Thorne, you've created a problem that we're going to have to solve." "We?" I repeated, latching on to the pronoun, because it suggested something I hadn't expected. Some kind of partnership or collaboration rather than the termination I'd been bracing myself for since the moment he'd stepped into that basement. Those children are living in a death trap that could collapse or catch fire or be raided by Volkov's men at any moment. You're walking through enemy territory every single day like you're invisible when you're anything but. And you're trying to feed and clothe 6 kids on an income that can barely support one person," he said, ticking off the problems on his fingers like he was preparing a business presentation. "So yes, because I'm going to help you fix this situation in a way that doesn't end with all of you dead or worse." I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said, trying to understand why Dante Calvetti, feared mafia boss and ruthless businessman, would offer to help a group of orphans he'd just discovered existed. And the only explanation I could come up with was that this was some kind of trick, some manipulation designed to gain leverage over me or extract information or achieve some goal I couldn't yet see. "Why would you help?" I asked, voicing the question that was screaming through my mind, because men like him didn't do things out of kindness, didn't offer assistance without expecting something substantial in return. His expression shifted into something I couldn't read, something that might have been calculation or vulnerability, or some strange combination of both. And when he answered, his voice carried a note of honesty that I absolutely didn't expect from a man who had built his empire on secrets and lies. "Because you walked into my office 6 months ago with forged references, and a desperation you tried to hide but that I could smell like blood in the water. And instead of turning you away or exploiting your obvious need, I hired you because something about you reminded me of myself at your age. Hungry and desperate and willing to do whatever it took to survive," he said. And the admission felt like a gift, or possibly a weapon. "Because you've been the best assistant I've ever had, despite running a secret orphanage on the side, which suggests a level of competence and dedication that's almost impossible to find. And because if I let you continue this way, you're going to get yourself killed, and that would be a tremendous waste of potential that I'm not willing to accept." The words hung in the air between us, honest and calculating and somehow both mercenary and kind, and I realized that this was how Dante Calvetti operated. Not through simple cruelty or straightforward benevolence, but through a complex calculus that weighed costs and benefits and opportunities in ways that served his interests, while occasionally aligning with something that looked almost like doing the right thing. "What do you want in return?" I asked, because there was always a price, always an exchange, and I needed to know what I'd be trading for his help before I agreed to anything. "You work for me until the debt is paid, and I mean really work for me. No more secrets, no more mysterious departures, complete transparency about your life and your obligations so I can factor them into my security planning and ensure that your vulnerabilities don't become mine," he said, laying out terms that were somehow both more and less than I'd expected. "And you let me do this properly, with a real building and proper food and educational resources, and everything those children need to have an actual chance at life. Because if I'm going to invest in this situation, I'm not going to half-ass it by letting you continue to operate out of a basement that should be demolished." I wanted to argue, wanted to maintain my independence and refuse his help, because accepting it meant becoming indebted to a man whose world was built on violence and crime. But I thought about Mira's too thin frame, and the way Marcus's shoes were held together with duct tape, and how the twins still woke up screaming from nightmares about the closet. And I knew that my pride was worth less than their well-being, that whatever price Dante Calvetti extracted from me would be worth paying if it meant giving those children something better than a condemned basement and stolen food. "I need to know that you're not going to hurt them, that they're not going to become leverage or pawns in whatever games you play with your enemies," I said, establishing my one non-negotiable condition. "I don't hurt children, Miss Thorne, regardless of what you might think about me or my business," he said, and there was something almost offended in his tone, as though I'd insulted him by suggesting he might. "I have many sins on my conscience, but that's a line I've never crossed and never will, so your children will be safe from me, and if I have anything to say about it, safe from everyone else as well." The way he said, "your children," made something warm unfurl in my chest, a recognition that he understood they were mine in every way that mattered, despite the lack of legal or biological connection. And I found myself nodding before I'd fully processed the implications of what I was agreeing to. accepting his help and his terms, and binding myself to him in a way that went far beyond the employer-employee relationship we'd maintained for 6 months. "Okay," I said quietly, the word feeling like a surrender and a victory, and the start of something I couldn't yet name. "But I want to be clear that if you betray them, if you use them against me or put them in danger, I will find a way to destroy you even if it kills me in the process." The threat should have been laughable coming from a secretary to one of the most powerful crime bosses in the city. But Dante didn't laugh, didn't dismiss my words as empty bravado, and instead he nodded slowly as though accepting the terms of a contract between equals. "Understood," he said simply. And then he did something that shocked me more than anything else that had happened in this impossible day. He extended his hand for me to shake, offering me the same gesture he used to seal deals with his business partners and rival families, treating my threat and my acceptance as worthy of the formal acknowledgement that came with his respect. I took his hand, felt the warmth of his palm against mine and the strength in his fingers as they closed around my hand in a grip that was firm, but not crushing. And in that moment, something shifted between us. Some fundamental change in the dynamic that had governed our relationship for 6 months. And I knew with absolute certainty that my life had just become infinitely more complicated in ways I couldn't begin to predict, but also, perhaps, infinitely better for the 6 children waiting for me in a basement who deserved more than I could give them alone. Dante Calvetti kept his word with the kind of ruthless efficiency that had built his empire. And within 72 hours of our conversation in the back of his Mercedes, he had purchased a 4-story brownstone in a neighborhood that straddled the invisible border between respectability and the kind of working-class grit that wouldn't raise questions about a woman suddenly housing 6 children. And the speed with which he moved was both impressive and terrifying, because it demonstrated exactly how much power he wielded, how easily he could reshape reality to match his vision when he decided something needed to happen. The building came fully furnished with beds that had actual mattresses instead of carpet remnants, a kitchen with appliances that worked, and food in the refrigerator that hadn't been stolen or purchased with carefully hoarded coins, and security measures that included cameras at every entrance, and what Dante casually referred to as discreet protection, which I understood to mean armed guards who would watch over the children without being obvious about it. And I should have felt relieved or grateful, but instead, I felt the weight of obligation settling over me like chains made of gold. Moving the children from the basement to their new home had been simultaneously joyful and heartbreaking, watching their faces light up when they saw bedrooms with actual doors and windows that let in sunlight and a living room large enough for all of them to sit comfortably. But also seeing the fear in their eyes because they'd learned through brutal experience that good things were usually temporary, that adults who made promises inevitably broke them, and no amount of my reassurance could completely erase the worry that this too would be taken away. Mira had cried when she saw the room she would share with the twins, actual tears streaming down her face as she touched the pink bedspread and the stuffed animals arranged on the pillows, and Marcus had stood in the doorway of what would be his first private space in his entire life, with an expression that looked like he was trying not to feel hope, because hoping hurt too much when it was inevitably crushed, and I had wanted to promise them that this was permanent, that Dante wouldn't take it away. But I'd learned the same lessons they had about broken promises, and so instead I just held them and let them feel whatever they needed to feel. The price for Dante's generosity became clear when I returned to work the following Monday and found that my role had fundamentally changed in ways that went far beyond the transparency he'd demanded, because I was no longer just his secretary managing calendars and filtering calls, but something closer to a confidant, someone he consulted about decisions that had nothing to do with administrative efficiency and everything to do with the moral calculations that apparently kept him awake at night despite his carefully cultivated reputation for ruthless amorality. He asked my opinion about territorial disputes and protection arrangements, wanted to know what I thought about potential business partners, and proposed expansions into new markets. And there was something almost vulnerable in the way he sought my input, as though my outsider perspective offered him something his lifetime of criminal enterprise couldn't provide. and I found myself drawn into his world in ways that terrified me, because the more I understood about how his empire functioned, the more complicit I became in its darker operations. The shift in our dynamic didn't go unnoticed by his organization, and I could feel the weight of suspicious eyes tracking my movements through the building, could hear the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, could sense the resentment from men who had served Dante for decades, and suddenly found themselves bypassed in favor of a woman who had been there for mere months. And I knew that I had inadvertently made myself a target by accepting his help, that there were people within the Calvetti organization who would see my influence as a threat or an opportunity, depending on how they calculated their own interests. Dante seemed unconcerned about the political implications of our changing relationship, or perhaps he was simply confident enough in his authority that he didn't care what his subordinates thought. But I had survived this long by paying attention to power dynamics and reading the subtle currents of organizational politics. And what I was reading in the faces around me suggested that my elevated position had put me in a dangerous spotlight. The attack, when it came, was precisely calculated to exploit the one vulnerability that Dante had created by helping me, and I should have seen it coming, should have anticipated that his enemies would notice his sudden interest in a formerly unremarkable neighborhood, and his uncharacteristic generosity toward a group of orphans who had no obvious connection to his business interests. I had left the office at my usual time, though now it was 5:30 p.m. rather than 3:17, since the children were settled and safe, and didn't need me to arrive at a precise moment, and was walking the 3 blocks to the subway station when the black van pulled up beside me with the kind of practiced precision that suggested professional execution rather than random violence. And before I could even process what was happening, hands were grabbing me and pulling me inside, and something sharp was pressing against my neck in a way that communicated very clearly that struggling would be a fatal mistake. The men who had taken me were Russian, their accents making that obvious even before I saw the tattoos that marked them as Bratva, and the one who seemed to be in charge, a man with ice-blue eyes that were several shades colder than mine, and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, smiled at me with the kind of anticipatory cruelty that made my blood run cold as he explained in heavily accented English that I was going to be a guest of Viktor Volkov until Dante Calvetti agreed to certain territorial concessions that had been under dispute for the past 18 months. The implication was clear. I had become valuable enough to Dante that kidnapping me was worth the risk of escalating their conflict, that Volkov had noticed the brownstone and the security, and Dante's unusual personal interest in my well-being, and had correctly calculated that I represented leverage worth exploiting. And I felt fury surge through me alongside the fear because I had known this was a possibility, had warned Dante that the children couldn't become pawns, but I had never considered that I might become one instead. They took me to a warehouse in the industrial district, where the smell of the river mixed with oil and rust and something that might have been old blood, and the hours that followed were a study in psychological torture as Volkov's men made it very clear what would happen to me if Dante didn't cooperate, didn't agree to their terms, didn't prove that I was worth more to him than the territory they were demanding. And I tried to maintain the same icy composure that had served me well in Dante's office, but it was harder when you were zip-tied to a chair and listening to men discuss your potential dismemberment with the casual tone usually reserved for discussing lunch options. The message they sent to Dante was simple and brutal. Give us the South Harbor territory and the associated shipping operations, or we start sending back pieces of his secretary until he changes his mind. And I found myself hoping that he would be pragmatic, that he would recognize I wasn't worth a war, that he would cut his losses and negotiate my release for something less than they were demanding. Because the alternative, that he would choose me over strategic advantage, seemed both impossible and terrifying in its implications. But I had underestimated exactly who Dante Calvetti was when someone took something he considered his, had failed to understand that the man who had built an empire on calculated violence had a capacity for uncalculated rage that he kept carefully controlled until someone gave him a reason to unleash it. And when he came for me 6 hours after my kidnapping, He didn't come to negotiate or compromise or find a diplomatic solution. He came with 20 men armed with weapons that belonged in war zones rather than criminal disputes, and the sound of gunfire echoing through the warehouse was almost beautiful in its terrible precision, each shot carefully placed and devastatingly effective. And I watched through the haze of fear and exhaustion as Dante Calvetti methodically executed every single person who had participated in my capture, with the kind of cold efficiency that suggested this wasn't rage at all, but something far more dangerous, controlled fury directed with surgical precision toward a specific goal. When he reached me, his expensive suit was spattered with blood that wasn't his, and his hands were steady as they cut through the zip ties, and the first words out of his mouth weren't questions about my condition or apologies for putting me in danger, but a statement delivered with absolute certainty. "You're mine, Ophelia, and I don't negotiate for what belongs to me. I take it back, and I make sure everyone understands what happens when they touch something of mine." The possessiveness in his voice should have terrified me, should have triggered every survival instinct I possessed that warned against belonging to dangerous men. But instead I found myself leaning into his touch as he helped me stand, finding strange comfort in the certainty of his claim. And when he lifted me into his arms and carried me out of that warehouse past the bodies of men who had threatened me, I wrapped my arms around his neck and let myself admit what I'd been denying for weeks. That somewhere between the basement discovery and the brownstone purchase and the late-night strategy sessions, I had stopped seeing Dante Calvetti as just my employer and started seeing him as something far more complicated and dangerous and possibly essential to whatever version of myself I was becoming. The aftermath of the warehouse massacre should have been the end of everything. My job, my carefully constructed life, my ability to maintain the fiction that I was just a secretary working for a legitimate businessman. But instead it became a beginning of something I had never allowed myself to imagine possible, because Dante Calvetti had shown me exactly who he was in the most visceral way imaginable. And rather than running from the blood and violence and brutal possessiveness, I found myself moving closer to it, understanding that the darkness in him was the same darkness that had kept me alive through foster homes and street corners and situations that should have destroyed me. I returned to work the next day, despite the bruises on my wrists from the zip ties and the exhaustion that went bone deep, because staying home would have been an admission of weakness or trauma. And I had learned long ago that survival meant continuing to function even when every part of you wanted to collapse. And when I walked into the office at my usual early hour, Dante was already there, waiting for me with an expression that suggested he hadn't slept at all, and probably wouldn't until he was certain I was truly okay. We didn't talk about what had happened, didn't process the violence or discuss the implications of his declaration of ownership, because there were some truths that existed beyond language, that could only be understood through actions and choices, and the way two people oriented themselves around each other in the quiet moments between crises. And instead, we fell into our routine with a new layer of understanding beneath the professional efficiency, a recognition that we had crossed some invisible boundary, and there was no going back to the careful distance we'd maintained before. The days that followed established a new pattern, one where I no longer left at any specific time, but instead stayed until the work was done, or until Dante suggested we visit the brownstone together. And those visits became the highlight of my existence, watching him interact with the children with an awkwardness that gradually transformed into something approaching genuine affection, seeing Marcus slowly lower his defenses around a man who treated him like an equal rather than a charity case, witnessing Mira climb into Dante's lap during story time with the kind of unconscious trust that children only gave to people who had proven themselves safe. The children had questions, of course, because they were survivors who had learned to read adult relationships for signs of danger or opportunity. And Marcus cornered me one evening while Dante was helping the twins with their homework and asked me point blank if the Mafia boss was my boyfriend, his 14-year-old face trying to maintain sophisticated skepticism, while his eyes betrayed genuine curiosity, and maybe hope that I might have found something good, in a world that had given him precious little evidence that good things existed. I didn't know how to answer him, because boyfriend seemed too simple a word for what Dante had become. Protector, partner, benefactor, obsession. And so instead I told him the truth as I understood it. That Dante Calvetti was a dangerous man who had chosen to use his power to keep us safe. That I trusted him in ways I had never trusted anyone except Ruth. And that whatever was developing between us was complicated and probably ill-advised, but also somehow inevitable. Like two planets caught in each other's gravitational pull and spiraling toward collision or fusion or something in between. The shift from professional relationship to something more personal happened, so gradually that I couldn't identify a specific moment when everything changed. But there were small intimacies that accumulated over weeks. Dante's hand on my lower back as we navigated through the brownstone. The way he started bringing me coffee in the morning prepared exactly the way I liked it, without me ever having told him my preferences. The late nights in his office when we would finish the day's work, and then just talk. Really talk. About childhoods marked by violence and neglect. About the people we'd had to become to survive. About the strange miracle of finding someone who understood the particular wounds that shaped you. He told me about his father's brutality and his mother's absence, and the uncle who had taught him that power was the only thing that mattered in a world designed to crush anyone without it. And I shared my own history of foster homes and abuse, and the terrifying moment when Ruth had looked at a 15-year-old thief and decided to see potential instead of pathology. And in those conversations, we built something that felt like foundation, like the beginning of trust between two people who had learned not to trust anyone. The evening that everything crystallized into undeniable reality was unremarkable in most ways. Just another day ending in the usual manner with both of us preparing to leave the office. But when I stood at 3:16 p.m., my old departure time that I no longer needed to observe, but that had become so ingrained in my rhythm that I still felt the pull of it. I didn't reach for my purse or head toward the elevator. I just stood there looking at Dante across the expanse of his office, and the question I saw in his eyes was the same one that had been building between us for weeks. "The children want to meet the man who saved me," I said, even though he'd met them dozens of times already, even though what I really meant was something entirely different. Something about choosing him and letting him choose me, and acknowledging that whatever this was between us deserved to be named and claimed rather than existing in the careful ambiguity we'd maintained. "And I want you to come with me. Not as my employer or their benefactor, but as the man who somehow became essential to every part of my life without me quite noticing when it happened." The vulnerability in my admission hung in the air between us, and I watched Dante process my words with the same careful attention he brought to everything, his storm-gray eyes searching my face for certainty or doubt. And when he finally moved, crossing the space between us with steps that seemed both purposeful and hesitant, I held my ground and waited for him to close the distance that had always existed between what we were and what we could be. His hands came up to cup my face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone capable of such violence. And when he kissed me, it was with the kind of reverence usually reserved for fragile things, as though he understood that for all my survival skills and hard-won strength, this moment required softness, required him to prove that he could be something other than the brutal efficiency I'd witnessed in that warehouse. We went to the brownstone together that evening, and the children greeted us with the unsurprised acceptance of young people who had already figured out what adults were still dancing around. And when Mira asked if Mr. Calvetti was going to be staying for dinner every night now, I looked at Dante and saw my own answer reflected in his expression. Yes, and breakfast too, and all the moments in between, because we had somehow created a family out of the broken pieces of our separate lives, had built something worth protecting from a condemned basement and a mafia empire, and the stubborn determination of people who refused to accept that their damage made them unworthy of connection. The evening unfolded with comfortable chaos as the children competed for Dante's attention, and I made dinner in a kitchen that still felt too nice to be real. And I caught myself thinking about Ruth and how she would have loved this. Loved seeing the children safe and fed and surrounded by people who had chosen to love them. Loved knowing that her legacy of saving broken things had continued beyond her death in ways she never could have imagined. Later, after the children were in bed, and Dante and I sat in the living room with glasses of wine that cost more than I used to make in a week, he asked me the question I'd been waiting for. Wanted to know why I had chosen 3:17 p.m. as my departure time all those months ago. What significance that specific minute held that made it worth building my entire routine around it. I took his hand, threading my fingers through his in a gesture that still felt new and significant, and I told him the truth I'd never shared with anyone. That 3:17 p.m. was the exact moment 16 years ago when Ruth had found me trying to steal her purse on a street corner, the precise minute when my life had started, when someone had looked at me and decided I was worth saving, despite all evidence to the contrary, and that carrying that time forward had been my way of honoring her memory, of remembering that transformation was possible even for people society had discarded. "And now?" Dante asked, his thumb tracing patterns on my palm that sent shivers up my arm, and I knew he was asking about more than just the time, was asking about what 3:17 meant in this new life we were building together. "Now it's the moment I found you," I answered, leaning into his warmth and feeling the rightness of it settle into my bones, like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Or maybe the moment you found me, standing in a basement surrounded by children who needed saving, and instead of seeing a liability or a problem to be solved, you saw something worth keeping, worth protecting, worth building a future around, and that kind of recognition, being truly seen by someone who understands the darkness because they've lived in it too. That's rarer than any amount of money or power or security you could ever offer. We sat in the quiet of that revelation. Two damaged people who had somehow found each other across the distance of different worlds and impossible circumstances. And I understood that this was what love looked like when you'd survived enough to know its value. Not hearts and flowers and romantic gestures, but the steady certainty of someone who would burn down the world to keep you safe, who would look at your broken pieces and see possibility, who would choose you every single day at 3:17 p.m. and every moment in between, building a home from the ashes of who you used to be and the hope of who you might become together.